listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
What's up? Hope you're well, and thanks for checking out my podcast, Straight to Video. Now, once I hit that 300 episode mark, just a couple of weeks ago, I said I was going to take my foot off the gas a little and maybe rethink the format of the show, but weirdly, a bunch of really cool interview opportunities came up, and these last few shows have been some of my favourite conversations so far. So right now, for today's show and next week's at least, it's business as normal, and I hope you're enjoying them. Today, well, this is a pretty cool one. I think today's guest has influenced a lot more guitarists and bass players the world over than he actually gets credit for. Whether it be players just starting out, or maybe you're a fan of Slash, Eddie Van Halen, or Randy Rhoads, and you ever wanted to learn to play their songs, well, today's guest probably had a hand in that somewhere along the way. The name Wolf Marshall should immediately unlock memories if you ever picked up a guitar in the 80s and early 90s, as Wolf's name was regularly seen in guitar magazines, and he was one of, well, I'm going to say without doubt, he was the name you always saw on the Guitar Tablature books that we all dived into when wanting to learn our favourite songs. Wolf's career, as you will hear, has spanned many decades and seen so many incredible musical movements, from his childhood in the 60s through to his touring days in the 70s and 80s, right through to his rise to becoming one of the most recognisable names and faces in guitar tuition, whether it be hard rock or even jazz, which today he is still very much at the forefront of with his new jazz guitar course, which you can learn about over at wolfmarshall.com. It really was a thrill for me to connect with someone who was there right from the very start of my own musical adventure, and to spend a little time hearing about his journey was awesome, and hopefully you'll enjoy it too. As always, this Straight to Video podcast is proudly presented to you in association with Affinity Photo, an incredible piece of photo editing software which I've been using for graphic design the past couple of years. I use Affinity Photo to create the podcast episode artwork you see each week, and it's an extremely affordable alternative to other programs on the market, so please check them out at affinity.serif.com. Alright, let's do this. Hands up if you had a VHS copy of Play Rock Guitar when you first started out playing. I know I did, as did many of my friends, so it was great to chat with the guy behind all of that. Make sure to check out wolfmarshall.com to learn even more about this legend's career, but right now, please enjoy my straight to video chat with the one and only Wolf Marshall.
Good to meet you, Rob, I take it, right?
It is. How you doing? Well, fantastic to connect with you.
Yes, beautiful. Look forward to speaking with you.
How's your morning going? We're 8 hours apart.
Yeah, I had a little Zoom meeting this morning, and now I'm getting ready to do something about 11:30. I've got another meeting I'm going to with some musicians and talking us through our typical music biz stuff. I belong to a group. We meet every week. We're all involved in the music business peripherally. You know, some are like worship team leaders, some are like rockers. It's just all different facets of the experience of music. So anyway, I join up with them every Thursday morning. I'll be a little late today, but they'll understand. How about you? What's going on your end?
It's been pretty busy. I do like the tribute band stuff, and I do like a pop band. So yeah, it's been getting pretty busy just lately. So can't complain as long as we're getting out there.
Who are you tributing?
Oh, do you really want to know?
Sure.
We're actually in the UK's only Poison tribute band.
Oh, okay. Yes, Bobby Dog. Very good.
I love those songs. Poison are the band that made me want to be in a band back in the day. So to play those songs, it's just a lot of fun.
Because I remember they had this unusual show. There was a place in Malibu where I lived from 85 all the way to 2001. I lived in that community, and they had a little bar there where Eddie Van Halen played, and Albert Lee and Steve Morse, whenever they come to town, the Music Man guys. And once they had Sam Kinison doing his routine there, just a little bar. Nobody knows about it. It's all word of mouth. It was called a Trancas Bar. Don't look for it now. There's a Starbucks there now.
As there is everywhere.
Yeah, Starbucks and affiliates. But anyway, yeah. So, and once Poison played there, for some reason, I think it was around 1990.
That'd have been crazy to see, especially if it was 1990, because they was like still top of the world at that point.
Yeah, but you know, so was Eddie and Steve Morse. I mean, these people aren't slouches, so they're pretty visible too. It was just a place where you could go and hang and play stuff casually, and it wasn't going to be paparazzi. It was just locals Eddie lived very close to Trancas Bar because he was on Broad Beach with Valerie Bertinelli still at that point. He could have walked there.
Imagine we'll just go for a quick drink in this bar, and there's Eddie Van Halen.
Yeah, playing, with Steve Morse. They both were new to Music Man at that point.
Yes.
And then Albert Lee, who lives in Calabasas, adjoining city to Malibu, he was always there with his Sterling Ball guys that he hung out with, a kind of a country rock band. Funky little places, like I said, Malibu, the Trancas Bar, but right across the hill, Santa Monica Mountains, right in the valley, there was another place called the Agura Inn. It was like a pool table dominated the place. That's how small it was. And these kind of cowboy guys and their girlfriends and just people that hung out locally. Albert Lee would play there regularly. You'd walk in, you'd see the greatest living country guitar player just hanging out and playing his Elvis stuff.
Where was your favorite hangout back in the day?
Which day are you talking about? Because I had many different days.
If we're talking around like that late 80s, 90s period, where would you?
Oh, well, I lived in Malibu. So, I went into town once in a while. Some friends are playing. When Eric Johnson would play someplace in Westwood or something, I'd go see him, or Santa Monica. There was a Santa Monica theater and stuff on Broadway. And then the Valley. Anyone was playing. The country club scene was kind of over then, so you wouldn't see that country club scene. That was in the 80s where Michael Schenker and Yngwie would play the country club. That was a different period, mid-80s. That's actually when I played the country club. But that's when every rock band in the world wanted to play that, because that was the next step. From there, you maybe could become an opening act to Black Sabbath or Deep Purple or something.
Unreal. It's hard to imagine it these days. It really is.
Yeah, it was such an active scene. I was so lucky to be involved in like 4 or 5 different scenes musically that really just shaped the musical aspect completely apart from my career as an educator and publisher and transcriber and, content creator for a bunch of people. Whole different world.
Have you had much time to come to the UK at all?
No, unfortunately. I would love to. I have done business with people in the UK. One of my earlier publishers was Music Sales, that owns all the rights globally to a lot of the music, like AC/DC, David Gilmour. What else did I do? I'm trying to think of other projects. Jeff Beck. They had a lot of their print rights. So I became associated with Music Sales, about 1985. So I used to see those folks all the time in New York, where they had an office in New York, Bob Wise and his people. And they handled a number of my products that were not for domestic, but for foreign distribution.
So you didn't come over for the Starlix thing with Brian May or anything like that?
That actually was done as a very informal thing. So I wasn't in person there. I was involved in the pre-production of the audio. And I was involved, obviously, in transcribing the music. And Brian did such a brilliant job. You know the story behind that, right?
No.
Originally, Starlix was a audio only cassette and booklet.
Oh, right. The little instructional things. I think I probably had a Poison one of that.
We didn't have Poison yet because they hadn't come out yet. This started about 82, 83.
Okay.
So we had all the big boys, Eddie Van Halen, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple. On the jazz side, George Benson. On the country side, we had Albert Lee. And these were just people, studio musicians doing play-alikes. I did all the rock stuff. A guy named Kevin Dukes did some of the country, and I can't remember who did the jazz, like Lee Ritenour and George Benson. I can't recall who did those. But anyway, sooner or later, they decided they wanted to go and do real artist performances because it was an easy formula. You just get the guy to play 20 licks and record it. We had a studio that was very compliant. The studio guy could just record. It could be done very quickly. And then I would transcribe it and it'd be out, within a month or two. So we tried to get Eddie to come in. We tried to get a number of people, Tony Iommi, it went on and on. Carlos Cavasso, a lot of the folks that were coming up in like 82, 83. Anyway, they contacted Brian May, and he was one of the few people that said, yeah, I'll do one. On a shoestring budget, we flew like minimal production crew, just like one guy who's sort of director and one guy who's in charge of video, and nobody else could come. Just a budgetary thing to fly to England because we were just a small company in LA. And Brian said to them, why don't we just do a video?
Wow. So that was the instigation of it then?
It was Brian's idea to do a video. And then from that point on, we told all the artists that were coming up, Lukather, Larry Carlton, Al McKay, May with Earth, Wind and Fire, Albert Lee, all the next guys, they were all, if Brian will do one, we'll all do videos.
I love that. I didn't realize Brian was like the first and actually came up with the idea.
Yeah, he was the spark plug.
Fantastic. Oh, I love that. That's brilliant. You're out on the West Coast now, Wolf, but am I right? Was you born in New York originally?
I was born in New York. How did you know that? Actually, it's in a lot of my books, but yeah, that's okay.
What took your family out to California? Was it during the 60s they came out?
No, it was earlier than that. I was born in New York. I lived there for the first 5-6 years of my life. My dad was an engineer, like a civil engineer, designing bridges and buildings and, office stuff, whatever. And so he was freelance. He would just go to whatever company. He got a real nice offer to go. He was in New York. He got an offer to go to San Francisco first, then Los Angeles. But my mom was a classical pianist and she would just go, she would have music in the family. So those were my two earliest reference points.
Do you have like any super early memories about coming out to California, or was you too young to kind of recall that?
Oh, I was about 6 when we lived in San Francisco. The first 5 years were in New York. I still remember New York very well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Many of us know you from your work throughout the late 80s and 90s when a lot of us were massively getting into rock music. But that scene, like you mentioned, was just one of many you got to experience out in California. Do you recall like the first music that came along that really took you by surprise? Like, what is this I'm hearing? I've never heard anything so exciting.
Well, it's probably not going to be that dramatic for you. But when I first heard R&B music in the early 60s, was what really turned me around. I missed the Elvis generation and all Buddy Holly and all that. My mom was such a strict classical musician. She said, you're not going to listen to any rock and roll or pop music. She said, no Sinatra, no Perry Como, and no Frankie Avalon, and none of these people that were, top 40. So the Buddy Holly and all that stuff. But then when the Beatles came out, that was where she changed everything. She became one of the hardest core Beatle fans I know.
Who was a favorite Beatle?
I think George Harrison. But anyway, she took all 3 kids. I have a younger brother and sister. She took all of us to see the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl twice.
Wow.
And we were young. Yeah.
Do you recall any of that? Or do you just recall the screaming?
Of course. I remember All My Lovin'. I remember watching George Harrison's double stop solo. Yeah, it's imprinted in my mind forever. I remember how cool and suave John Lennon was with just the swagger. And then McCartney was the bubbly guy bouncing around with the Hofner. And Harrison was the serious guy playing the country licks that were so magnificent on all those early Beatle cuts.
So your mum didn't want you to listen to like any of the Buddy Holly and Elvis. Could you hear that music through your friends? Or was you like wondering like, what is this music actually sound like?
So the first music that really turned me around was the R&B music. I think of 2 songs. I think of Personality by Lloyd Price. And I think of Stubborn Kind of Fella by Marvin Gaye. Those were the first 2 songs I really recall listening to and saying, oh, I got to start listening to that part of the radio. So I would turn the dial over to that part of the radio because always permanently set on classical music. She'd set it there and I would have to find classical music again and turn off the radio.
Yeah, make sure it's back in exactly the right spot.
Yeah, and make sure that it was done early enough that she couldn't tell that the tubes were warm.
Amazing. Did you get a chance to like come into contact with many musicians as a kid, or did they seem like superheroes and untouchable people?
Are you talking about like stars?
Well, just like being in the California area, you just see like a guy walking down the street with a guitar or anything
Absolutely.
like that.
As a teenager, I played the Sunset Strip where there are people like Steve Stills and Neil Young and David Crosby just walking around. I mean, I saw Jimi Hendrix walking around once on the Sunset Strip.
Was they kind of left alone to do their own thing when they was outside of a gig?
Yeah, it wasn't a big paparazzi scene like there is now. If Eric Clapton walked into someplace, he'd be mobbed. I mean, I saw the original Cream lineup at the Whiskey before Sunshine of Your Love was out as a single.
That's crazy. I mean, being in that scene, and you must have seen so many bands that went on to be huge.
Yeah, absolutely. John Mayall with Mick Taylor, Bloodwind Pig, guy who turned me on to jazz, Jeff Beck with Rod Stewart.
Was there a moment when you wanted to try and learn an instrument? Like you say, your mom she was a classical pianist.
I was already learning instruments. I was learning instruments at 7. 3 phases of classical: violin, piano, which she played, and cello.
Was you enjoying that?
It was a little bit regimented, so I didn't enjoy it. I loved the violin. I did not like piano that much. I didn't like sitting down and reading these remedial tunes, because I didn't get to play the kind of stuff she could play, Chopin and Beethoven. And I mean, it just sounded amazing. Debussy and all that. That was like her wheelhouse. That's how my ear got trained, was listening to her play.
Yeah.
From the time I was an infant.
I heard you were laid under the piano.
That's right. I've talked to psychologists and they say that's what can train your ear at an early age. And certainly I heard her practicing complicated music. And then if she ever made a little mistake, she would stop in the midst of this passage and go, oh, learn it again, phrase it again, and it would just continue. So wrong note, right note. That's what it's supposed to sound like.
It's ingrained in there from such an early age.
Yeah, you just gotta tell, she's out of the key a little bit. Then she stopped. Yeah.
Once you're out in California, you had a store nearby called Bettman Music in the 1960s.
Well, that was 2 blocks from where I lived.
Wow. Run by Saul Bettman and his family from his house originally.
That's right. Exactly. On Melbourne Street, I lived on Russell. It was ABC Studio was 2 blocks away. So I would go to Shindig and I'd see like Mitch Ryder, and I saw the Stones and all that stuff there before they were big.
How did you find out about the music store? Was it just so well known?
Because I went to school with the son, Mel, and he was my age, and his dad owned the music store. And when I started getting interested in pop music and R&B, he said, my dad owns a store. I play saxophone like my dad. So we went to the store, and it's like a treasure chest of Fender amps and Fender guitars and old used instruments that you would never see at the fancy places.
What was it like going in somewhere like that at a young age? Was it scary or intimidating, or did you immediately feel at home?
No, I felt immediately at home. It kind of felt like places I'd been. It was dark and curtains and different amps pushed here and there. It reminded me of my uncle's house because he used to collect all kinds of paraphernalia, recording gear and cement mixers, everything you can imagine. He was a collector of that stuff. So he had it all over his property. So I got used to seeing that growing up.
Was you like immediately drawn to the guitar after the George Harrison thing? And then
actually, this was before I saw the Beatles. This is junior high school. It was roughly around the time I first heard of the Beatles, but I was still trying to learn surf guitar.
Was that the band you was in at school?
Yeah, a bunch of classmates. We played all the old surf songs, Miserlou and Pipeline and all that stuff.
Was you like the big rock stars around school, or was being in a band commonplace?
There were a couple of real good players, but we had no immediate rock stars in my school.
Did you get your first guitar from Bettman's music?
Well, I rented a guitar as a birthday present from my mom for 1 month. I don't consider that like having a guitar. It was such a temporary, let's see what you can do. Because I've been through these classical instruments. And she said, what do you really want to do? I don't want you to drop music. I want you to keep with music. What do I got to do? I said, I love rock and I love pop and I love R&B. I want an electric guitar. And so we went to a place, I think it was in Pasadena, where they had rentals. We didn't know about Bettman at the time. She just said, I know this place in Pasadena. And we went there. We rented a cheap K guitar with 1 pickup and some kind of silly little, I think, Silvertone amp or something. A little one, like a little real cheap Sears amp. I taught myself more music in 1 month. She said, okay, I guess that's the instrument you should play.
How was it when you first put the guitar on your lap or something like that? Did you feel comfortable with it? I know first time I held a guitar, I was like, what the hell do I do with this thing?
No, I felt like immediately drawn to it. It felt like a little bit bigger violin. I mean, I love the violin because I could walk around and hold it and do all that stuff that felt different than sitting down with a cello or sitting down at a piano. I love the movement of it and the fact that you feel really free. And I felt that with the guitar right away. And it was the music I enjoyed. I remember the first tune I transcribed was Link Wray's Rumble. I taught myself how to play. It's all open position chords and open pentatonic scale. I thought this is like perfect for me. I think I taught myself that at 14.
Was you just like learning stuff by ear? Did you have yourself had a music teacher?
Totally by ear. Nobody I knew read music on the guitar. Most of the people I know still don't read music on the guitar, unless you consider tablature reading music, but I don't really consider it reading music.
So as like the 70s roll around, like, so you mentioned things like really beginning to take off on the Hollywood Sunset Strip. You mentioned seeing Cream, and I guess there was bands like The Doors playing there. I would imagine you would have been one of the very first to see or hear Van Halen in the late 70s.
Well, going back a little bit to The Doors, we used to play a place called Guitarist where Van Halen did play later, about 10 years after we did. And the point I'm making is we were doing that thing there, and The Doors would come occasionally and see our set because they were at the Galaxy. And if somebody visiting at the Whiskey had a break between their sets, they might go over to Guitarist because it was a much more chill place to have a drink.
Right.
You'd see that. You'd see like maybe somebody from Buffalo Springfield in the crowd. I definitely know Jim Morrison was there. He was the Lizard. He just slid it along the Sunset Strip. He lived on La Cienega, I think, in an apartment there, and he just loved to hang.
So then, do you hear murmurings about Van Halen? You got to check out this band?
When I was hearing about Van Halen, I was already been studying jazz for nearly 10 years. I'd been through all this stuff. I'd graduated from UCLA already with theory degree. I'd been on the road with a really big pop band that had a #1 hit, R&B pop, not pop like it's not the Partridge Family. It was serious R&B, but they had a pop crossover hit. So we toured for 2 years and made a movie.
What was the name of the band? Can I ask?
The name of that group was Hot, and it was the first group that had an interracial front line of 3 girls, black lead singer who was fantastic, Gwen Owens, Kathy Carson, white blonde, very Germanic looking, and then Juanita Curiel, who had like the long Mexican flowing Indian looking woman. And then we were the backup band. We were the band that they toured with.
Did you enjoy being out on the road for that amount of time?
Oh, yeah. That was great. Because when you have a hit record, it's different. You fly everywhere. Everything's like first class, and you stay in great places and tour support and roadies and all that. I mean, it was just, it was a whole different thing.
Was that your very first experience of actual touring on a larger scale as well?
On a larger scale, yeah.
You went in big.
They had a hit, but because they recorded all their stuff in Muscle Shoals with like top-notch studio guys, that's where Duane Allman was and stuff like that. Muscle Shoals is like one of the heaviest R&B and blues recording places in the world. I mean, the Stones would record there and stuff to get that vibe. But anyway, they had studio musicians on all their records, the first 2 records, and that's what the hit came from. So they needed a band that could be that band live. So we were put together as the working band.
We segued from Van Halen to that.
Well, then Van Halen came out about 78, and that was about the time they had that hit.
Yeah.
I was in the R&B scene. Even though I heard about Eddie Van Halen, it was through friends of friends in LA. And certainly I heard on the first record, immediately people were playing Eruption. What do you think this is?
How was that for you? Because you seem to embrace that whole hard rock, originally called glam metal. More recently, people have termed it hair metal of the 80s. How did your playing change during that time? Was that exciting for you to see all these incredible guitar playing come to the forefront, not just in local clubs, but on national, global scale?
It was a return back because I'd already been playing blues rock a la Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck and Jimi Hendrix. And then I switched over to jazz for a while because the scene changed for me and I just wanted to improve my musical style. When the first glam bands came out and punk and all that stuff came out, that didn't interest me. To me, that was a throwback. To me, the classic was Hendrix, Clapton with Cream, Jeff Beck with Rod Stewart. When all that changed, because Hendrix died and Clapton picked up a Strat and started playing differently, became more minimal. And Jeff Beck was out of commission because he'd had a bad automobile accident. People didn't know if he was ever going to play again. Then I switched. This is the perfect time to go to jazz.
How was that transition into learning the hard rock stuff? Did it excite you?
It was very natural because I always loved the blues. And that's the kind of music we played that people like Jim Morrison would go and watch us play. We were playing all the Blues Breakers and Chicago blues stuff that we were picking up from John Mayall. And I think we were the only band on the Sunset Strip doing that at that point.
And what year would that have been?
That would have been 1967.
So what was the band which you had during the 80s playing the Strip? I've seen some photos.
That was a band I had called LA Rocks.
Tell me there's an X in that.
No, it was a TKS. It was a band that it was not managed well, so it fell apart. Even though we played some great venues and had strong contacts and everything, if the chemistry is not right in a band, it's just no matter what. You may have one good song and it'll hit, and then if the chemistry is wrong, it doesn't lead to anything lasting.
Where was you seeing your career around that point? Was you seeing yourself continuing as a touring recording musician, or did you have your heart set in teaching and going on to do all the transcribing and stuff?
I was a studio musician in the late 70s, touring in studio. Go on the road, and then we come back and we do record dates, or in those days, really more what I did was either jingles or what's called dubs, publishing demos. I fell into that niche rather than trying to compete with Larry Carlton and Lee Ritenour and Jay Graydon. I mean, they had all that wired in, Lukather. But the point is, I worked in that vein, and it was very productive and very lucrative. But of course, it was, you go from gig to gig to gig, until I got a little contract with a publishing company where I would assemble bands for all of their dubs. They would write songs, or they'd have songwriter banks where people would write songs, but then they'd send me a cassette. Write this down, get a band going. We're doing a session on Tuesday. Get a bass player, get a piano, get a drummer. We may need horns, get a singer. Anyway, I had to hire the band because they were just songwriters. That was lucrative for a year or so. And at the same time, I was touring with Hot. Later on, I toured with an MCA group called the Billy Hayes Band, but it went nowhere. They couldn't get a hit. But they were big money at the time from MCA, so they flew me out. They lived in Oregon, and we toured for a while in Nevada and stuff where they had some kind of local following. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I just mentioned that as a touring thing. No, I was in the studios assembling these projects, and one of the projects that came my way because I was freelancing was Starlix. So they had a paper, that's where Metallica met, called The Recycler. And everyone read it, and there was always music opportunities, or the Music Connection was another one. And we'd look at it, what bands need who, or whatever. And there was an ad. Can you play like Eddie Van Halen? Can you play like Jimmy Page? Can you play like Ritchie Blackmore? So I auditioned for them. I played some stuff. They said, okay, you're hired. Now we just got to find somebody who can write this licks down. I said, I can do that too. And I said, now we got to find somebody who can do the music notation. I can do that too. So I prepared music notation. I did all the transcribing, the licks, all that stuff. And they just picked it up, took it to a printer, and it became a booklet. And the cassette was just the studio session, edited into 20 licks.
Wow. Where was the offices based for Starlix?
They were in Santa Monica, which was cool because I was still in LA at that point.
How many people were working for them at the time? Because us being over here, when we'd see all these like names like Cherry Lane and all this kind of stuff, we never knew if it was like a big multi-people operation or just a small cottage industry.
Small. It was 3 guys who formed this. One guy was like a production manager, big oversight guy. One was a studio engineer. And the other fellow was the fellow who did all of the business. Take the stuff to the printer, make sure it was to the copyist by this point, all this stuff. He'd set up all the logistics. And one guy was just, in charge of getting artists and doing the public relations and just being sort of the president. But there were 3 guys. Let's see, Robert Decker was the engineer. Andrew Cross was the fellow who did a lot of the business day to day. And then Mark Freed was the guy the big overseer.
Was you like a pretty recognizable face on the whole scene during that time? Because I think he was giving lessons as well to some of the guys during the 80s.
I used to teach in the San Gabriel Valley at a big music store, and I got a lot of Randy Rhoads students that no longer could study with him, obviously. First, because he toured with Ozzy, and second, because he passed on. So I did get a lot of those students in the San Gabriel Valley. It was a whole scene. Pasadena is the San Gabriel Valley. It's all the Van Halen people. Shortly after that, Warren DeMartini and all that, just this whole scene came up around LA in that period. And I was right in the middle of it with the teaching thing.
Out of all the solos, was it Eruption that they wanted you to learn the most, or was there some other intros or things like that?
Oh, everybody wanted to learn different things. I remember some people wanted to learn stuff from Dio records, or they wanted to learn some old Black Sabbath. And I had people wanting to learn country guitar. I had a student that was 7 years old. I had one that was 86, and everything in between. Lots of teenagers wanting to be the next Van Halen.
Did you teach somebody from Faster Pussycat as well?
I did, Brent Musket. Yeah. He was just like getting a serious guitar player. He was great. He was a great kid at the time and really motivated and interested in music. And otherwise he wouldn't have stuck with the lessons. And he was different because he didn't want to only learn somebody else's licks. He already had ideas about trying to be a little more original. So I could see potential in him for doing more than just being a guy who could play licks.
How is it to see somebody like that go on to have a major record label?
Absolutely love seeing these people ascend. It's fantastic. Are you kidding? It's feels like you're helping them in some way get there.
You mentioned Starlix and then also Cherry Lane. They did video tutorials. I remember your Billy Sheehan ones and stuff like that. And
that was much later. That was about nearly 10 years later.
That had just been around 88, 89, 90 time, I guess, would it be?
Yeah, it was about 89, 90, right in there.
That's when tablature books and all that kind of thing was all over the place. Was it a Michael Schenker one, the first one, of that kind of scene that you transcribed?
That was the first one. I went to the president of Cherry Lane's house, a fellow named Milt Oken, and he said, stop putting my name on these books. I don't know anything about Michael Schenker, because it always said edited by Milt Oken. And so they get these rock guys and they put that name on there, and he said, we need some other face to do this.
Right.
So he said, I've been following your work on Starlix and I've heard about you. Because I was already working for the magazine at that point. The magazine they had called Guitar for Practicing Musician. So they knew about that. And he knew I was in LA. So we had a nice meeting and I started transcribing the rock books at that point.
Feel like in layman's terms, what's usually the process when given the task of creating tablature for the latest hard rock album?
You'd get the album, the advance usually, if they're going to do something like Guns N' Roses and stuff like that. By that point, you'd get the advance. Or when I did OU812, I got the advance copy before it was released by Van Halen.
Do you learn stuff by ear, or is it what is the transcribing process?
Always listen for a long time, as long as you can stand it, to really get familiar with the music. So I would recommend putting it in your car and driving, just where you can't get distracted. All you're doing is listening and driving. There's no phone ringing or somebody calling you from the other room. You're there. Even if at home I would get phone calls and stuff, it's distracting. Listening to music, I would have to be tunnel vision. And I do that and listen to it carefully, and sometimes with friends, and we talk about the music. And then when I actually sat down to transcribe it, I was familiar with it. And also I started to plot out, I can hear how the song form is. Eddie's doing this in the chorus, and there's going to be a solo after the bridge, things like that. You'd get the sense of all the organizational factors.
What was turnaround time on something like that? Did it vary per project, or was they pretty strict, we need to get this out to maximize around the album's release date?
It varies. It depends. Obviously, they didn't anticipate how big Guns N' Roses were, so they didn't put that same kind of urgency. But with Van Halen, I met with Van Halen. I said, it's been a dream of mine. All I really want to do through this publishing deal is be able to transcribe Van Halen 1. That's like a landmark album. I just would love to do that project because I'd already done the Randy Rhoads stuff and the Yngwie and all that. So those were like, and Michael Schenker, those were some of my favorite players. But the one that was missing was Eddie. He said, well, Wolf, I'd really like you to do my new one first. OU812. So we talked, and he did a really nice long interview that he let me record. He said, these are like little secrets behind the album. I'm going to give you this maybe as a way to incentivize you to do this one first. So we had a very nice intro that I created and wrote down from the stuff that we talked about and that he shared with me. And then later on, we had a similar thing for the first album.
That must have been pretty cool for you, starting on OU812, then going back and working on the earlier ones, because you see this guy's really analyze his playing and how his styles evolved and changed and his songwriting technique, because Eddie was always changing, going through into the keyboard elements and stuff like that. I mean, did you actually transpose keyboards onto guitar as well? Because I know that was sometimes a thing in the guitar magazines.
Obviously, it depends on the complexity of the keyboard part, but a lot of times we would adapt it so it could be played on the guitar.
Do I believe you did Hysteria by Def Leppard as well?
Yeah, I think I did do that one, Hysteria, and there was another one by Def Leppard too, I think. That was through Hal Leonard.
Right. That must be a challenge with the production work that goes on an album like that, the Mutt Lange production.
Yeah, right. And that was, at that point, Vivian Campbell wasn't in the group yet.
No, he came on the album after.
Because I knew Vivian personally from LA, but I didn't know any of the other guys. I met Phil Collin later at a Fender thing in the year 2016 or whatever it was, 14. But I'd never met any of those other guys other than Vivian. And at that point, I think when I met Vivian, he was with Whitesnake still. And then he formed some group for a while. That's when I saw more of him, called the River Dogs.
Did you ever have any players themselves come up to you once a tab book had been released to comment on your transcriptions of the songs?
Well, I remember Yngwie looked at Trilogy, and I've got the cover, and he wrote on there, "Not bad."
That's probably the best compliment you can get.
You got Eddie's inscription on Van Halen 1 that said, "Oh, this is great, Wolf. Too bad I can't read." So I got to frame that one.
Oh, that's unreal. That's fantastic. Hard rock went through such a big change in the 90s, but you continued to champion guitar through working on Wolf Marshall's Guitar One magazine. Was that already an existing publication which you got to be part of?
It was a part of my returning back to Cherry Lane. It was part of a business arrangement. One thing I said is, because I'd been with Guitar World at the time, and I wanted to create my own magazine that was emphasis on tutorial. I just had released my rock guitar method, 8 volumes, and I wanted to do a whole package around it that people could look at every couple of months. So we had the most transcriptions, 12 per magazine. All the articles were lesson oriented. You got together with Steve Vai. We talk about his record. There'd be licks. Or we talk about the same thing with maybe the Scorpions or Blackmore or, you name it, whoever it would be, Judas Priest. Whoever we got together with, it would be stuff that had their Alex Lifeson. They would have stuff, their licks would be part of it rather than just, their experiences like you find in most magazines. It's all text.
That must have been very hands-on for you then. Did that become almost like a full-time job?
It was an editor-in-chief, for 2.5 years. And it got me to the point, but I was hardly playing enough guitar. So after a while, I said, I'm going to hand this off and not continue it after, I think I did it for 2.5 years. 95, I think I handed it off like early 98.
Have you got copies of all of them in the archives?
Oh, yeah. They sent me boxes of it at the time, so I still have a few of them.
Whilst being heavily a rock pioneer during the 80s and 90s for all of us, I mean, many people mention Mel Bay's chord books, but I feel your name is just as important to many of us who grew up through that time. I mean, I've even got a copy of Play Rock Guitar here.
Oh, that's the one that was released all throughout the world by Music Sales.
There you go. That was in all my friends' houses back then.
And we had a lot of fun with that because it was I tried to develop a humor sense. So a lot of videos were very off-putting because they were very sterile. And I wanted this to be like, come on, kids, let's have fun.
Who created the set with the big guitar?
Yeah, exactly. That was shot in the same place we used to shoot Starlicks.
Oh, amazing. But you're also a force in the jazz world too, where you focus a lot of your energy and still very much teaching and spreading knowledge. What can you tell us about the latest jazz guitar course which you've got and how that came together?
That is the culmination of everything that I have done in the jazz world and all the lucky experiences I've had being able to study with Joe Pass, Pat Martino, Johnny Smith, Herb Ellis, George Van Apps, Howard Roberts. These are like really major artists. They would be like the Van Halens or the Hendrixes or something of that nature. There's schools of playing built around those guys. Like there's a Van Halen school of playing that, all the guys in the 80s had. And then you have the Joe Pass school of playing. There's still to this day people that try to sound like Joe Pass. And Pat Martino, same thing. And of course, I loved Wes Montgomery early on and all that stuff. I didn't get to meet him ever, but I met people who worked with him and learned things from him, like Pat Martino. I wouldn't say studied because they didn't do academics. They studied the way they played. And then that got passed on to me through osmosis.
Right. So how do you approach something like that in today's world where everything's so online and digital? This is still a physical book.
Well, here's the thing. There's over 600 audios and they are all online. People can either download them or they can work with them online and not clog up their laptop with these many, many audio tracks. And then they can use the player that Hal Leonard provides, allows loop points and slow down and all these other aspects that you may not have at home easily in your player. Like if you're playing it on iTunes or Apple Music or something, you can't stop and start and create locate points the same way you can on their player. But yeah, I'm also doing a lot of video that will be in support of that. Video channel for a company called TrueFire. I'll be doing my own video channel for them, and it will have a lot of reference to things in the book, but obviously it'll be demonstrated in a video form.
Have you always been comfortable on camera? You always seemed comfortable back in the day.
It was because I'm trying to be natural, even with the hair primped up, because I had, stylists and you got to look a certain way. You got to look like your hair's got to be bigger than whoever it was at that point that had big hair. Randy Rhoads.
You got to look like Adrian Vandenberg.
Got to be bigger than that, goes up 6 inches. You got to go 6.5. Much more teased out and blow dried and sprayed.
What do your jazz students think of it when they find old images of you back in the day?
It's just experience. You go through music and it's just part of the life. I've been lucky to have that life where I've been lucky to see the Beatles and Jeff Beck with Rod Stewart live and Eric Clapton with his painted guitar right in front of me, 6 feet away from me. And to be able to sit down in Joe Pass's house and play guitar with him. Or to be in a hotel room talking about Wes Montgomery with Pat Martino and him showing me stuff. So I want to share all that. I don't think the jazz students care that much about what was going on in the past because it just shapes who you are in the end anyway. Those experiences are necessary.
Are you still teaching like a whole different range of ages? Are there lots of young people coming through?
As you may or may not know, I was at UCLA for 16 years. Kenny Burrell had hired me to play after we did a concert together. And that's actually in my book. There's a page on my website that has a whole breakdown of the course and a picture of me with Kenny, etc. It's like a promotional aspect. But students coming right out of high school, and a lot of them were doing jazz all over the map. Some of them wanted to be like Wes Montgomery, and other guys were into Snarky Puppy. Some guys wanted to create their own new thing using electronica and stuff. So it was all over the map, and we had a thing called the Global Jazz Department, and it was literally global. I mean, we'd have all kinds of different things going on there. And so it was not necessarily only for one type of jazz student, that very academic type. It was wide ranging. That suits my personality anyway.
Do you still keep in touch with any of the bands or players from back in the day, people you've taught or anything like that?
Spoke to Jeff Watson not that long ago from Night Ranger.
Nice.
Musical director on his and Brad's video back in 87 or whatever it was. So, I stay in touch with these guys. Every once in a while I hear from Brad, or I would hear from who else? Lukather, of course. I stay in touch with Steve Lukather all the time. I haven't seen Larry since he's moved to Nashville, Larry Carlton.
Has Nashville ever been a draw for you?
I think that's for a different type of goal. I think it's a good place if you want to go somewhere and establish yourself because it's a happening scene compared to a lot of these other scenes are just more, I want to say docile by comparison with Nashville's music town. You go walk down the street, everything's music. It's like Beale Street in Memphis or something. You just see that probably how the old 52nd Street used to be in New York back in the days of Charlie Parker or something. Every time you have this certain scene like LA was in the 60s. Where else could you go to the Hollywood Bowl or something and see the Beatles and then walk across the street to the Palladium and see Hendrix walking around looking at Fender amps?
Sounds like you just made that up. It's unreal to think that was actually happening back then. Wolf, I want to thank you for chatting with me. I've really enjoyed it, and I wish you all the luck with the jazz guitar course and all your other projects.
It's a real pleasure to meet you and spend time with you.
You enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll speak to you soon.
Have a good one.
Massive thank you to Wolf Marshall for being such a great guest, incredibly humble, and for sharing his time here on the Straight to Video podcast. Outside of the dozens of tuition books he's released over the years, I hope he adds a biography to that list at some point, as it would be a thrill to learn even more about what he's seen and done. For now though, check out everything over at wolfmarshall.com, and next time you pick up a Guitar Tab book, have a look, as I'm sure it'll probably be Wolf's name on the cover. So this Saturday on October the 5th, Tape Stock 2 will be hitting the 80s Video Shop in Alverton, Derbyshire, which is just 10 minutes from Junction 28 of the M1. Held in conjunction with TVC, the Video Club Facebook group will be having a whole day of VHS related fun, from tape sales and trades, screenings in our movie room, and just a great chance for VHS and video fans from all over the country to meet up. The event is running from midday until late. Admission is free, so really hope some of you can attend. Be sure to follow the 80s Video Shop on whatever social media platform you use, and catch you then. So that's it for this week's episode of the podcast. So until we chat again, which will hopefully be next Friday, make sure to always be kind, please rewind and unwind, and I'll speak to you all real soon.